So next up we've got Dalton Barron, PhD student at Leeds Beckett University and sports scientist with Yorkshire Carnegie Under-16s. And worth noting, in collaboration with Catapult Sports, PhD investigating match demands of Rugby Super League. Over to you, mate.
Okay. So, thanks, Rob. Okay, so yeah, as Rob said, I'm Dalton Barron, PhD student here at Leeds Beckett. So just a bit of background first. So prior to the commencement of the 2018 Super League season, Catapult signed a league-wide deal with the Super League, the RFL and Leeds Beckett University. So part of that Super League deal is that Catapult gave 30 GPS units to each of the first teams within the Super League, and Leeds Beckett University actually have access to that data to do research with it. Okay, so just in terms of the burden to each of the clubs, they don't actually have to do anything. So once the GPS data is downloaded after a match, all they have to do is then full sync the data and then cloud archive it, and then that's their job done, and that's sort of where my job then begins. So I work in our studio, which is a sort of coding platform, statistical and analytical software. So the first thing I do is I identify the global periods, i.e. first half, second half, and also the interchanges. So basically identify when players are essentially playing. Second bit is removing the spikes or erroneous data. And the third one is just creating the metrics of interest and appending it to a sort of global database. So far we've kind of talked about like what are the match demands. So Dale sort of spoke about the different ways that we can analyze it, and Sarah sort of spoke about the differences between levels and positions. But what kind of missing at the moment is why do these match demands happen, and what's the context around that which causes these match demands to fluctuate. So I kind of superficially, broadly categorize them as sort of 3 or 4 different categories. So technical, tactical factors would be the first one. So things like position, sort of playing style, maybe the scoreline. Situational factors is maybe the more obvious one that springs to mind when you think of context. So things like home and away, the phase of the season, that match turnaround, that kind of thing. And the individual characteristics as well. So things like strength, speed, fitness. Can you recover from an intermittent bout of exercise quicker if you're fitter, that kind of thing. But we actually know that X rarely causes Y without interacting with another variable. So actually we know that these 4 categories of variables actually interact with each other before we get, for example, an output like relative distance. And we know that there's actually probably a lot more variables than just that. And as the variables go up, the complexity increases, and we get problems such as multicollinearity, which is sort of a measure of the intercorrelation between variables. It's also, if you think about it from an applied perspective as well, if we collect loads of variables, then it's a lot harder for us to sort of explain the demands of the game, because we don't want to be collecting loads of variables. We want to know which of those variables are important, which one of those variables are sort of telling us the same thing. So one thing we might do is try and reduce the complexity of the data set. And we can do different dimension reduction techniques. Dimension is essentially just a variable. So as the variables go up, the dimension goes up. And this is from 40 skills training sessions in rugby union. And we used a statistical technique called principal component, or it's a machine learning technique called principal component analysis on an individual level. So actually there's 21 participants there, so there's 21 models. Now if it's in the shaded area, then it means those variables are telling you the same thing. So actually distance, player load and session RP train load for our data set was telling us the same thing. And that's just an example of how we can sort of reduce variables from sort of 4 different variables to 2. So distance, player load, session RP train load, and high speed distance. Cool. So what we can do is, once we've got our model, we're happy with it, we've got a good R squared, what we can do is then validate the model. And this is a really good paper by Mladen Jovanovic, and it's basically talking about cross-validation. So is our model any good at predicting future values? Because although we know, right, we've got a good model, we can explain definitively what our match demands were for, say, the previous season, we don't know how good it's going to be in the future. So typically what we'll do is we'll take our whole data set and sort of split it into 75%, 25%. 75% we train the model, 25% we validate the model. And so we have a single team. So a single team, probably 30 matches minimum. So we take 23 matches to train the model, 7 to test the model. But actually what we'll have is, we times that by 12, so we actually have 360 matches. So you can see the advantage of having a league-wide deal in terms of the number of observations. After 2 seasons, we have 720 matches. After 3 seasons, I have at least 1,080 matches, and yeah, it's a lot of data. But I suppose the big question is so what? Well, if you consider that during your training week, again, we've seen this a couple of times. If you say we're on the Tuesday, which is going to be our heaviest day, what we might sort of want, what might be advantageous for us is to know what is our sort of predicted load, so we can appropriately prepare for that. And then you can start seeing, right, okay, we'll start to describe sort of this meters per minute, if we take that as an example, according to the context surrounding it. So we're in the Super 8 phase of the season, we're playing away, playing strong opposition. We want an estimation for the fullback. What does our training week look like? But what's really missing from this is, how do we actually quantify this thing, the load? So this is just a raw velocity trace. And if we apply sort of, this is a rolling 1 minute mean. If we apply it over it, we can actually find out the peak demand, similar to how Dale was saying earlier. And it actually turns out that for this play, it was 175 meters per minute. So in a minute, 175 meters, which occurs at this time point. You can actually see as well, once you actually plot the raw rolling average, you can actually see sort of how close the different spikes are to that peak demand. So if you're just taking one peak demand, is that really representative of their sort of maximum intensity? I'm not sure. But if we just take this peak demand that occurred at the end of the first half, sort of blow it up and sort of zoom in on it, we can see that actually this player accumulated most of the load in just one effort, and the rest of it's kind of walking or steady jogging. Now this is a second player with exactly the same peak demand. You can see that the velocity traces are totally different. The bottom guy's actually got a lot more sort of intermittent demands. So are we appropriately sort of quantifying the demand with just an overall summative metric? And what you might say is, right, well, we can use acceleration, which is a derivative of velocity. And then we might say something like, right, we can get the number of accelerations or number of decelerations above or below a threshold, respectively. But for me, we're taking out a dimension once we start doing that, because we lose information. If you consider that when this data was created, it was ordered. So actually the time element is really important. So yeah, just to sort of demonstrate that point, going back to our rolling 1 minute, this peak demand actually occurred at the end of the first half. Now if you consider that the internal load, probably hypothesize that if you did that peak demand at the end, it's probably a lot more physiologically demanding than if you did it at the start. So once you start summating these things and not considering the time element, then you're starting to lose information. So this is some really good research by Alice Sweetin looking at different movement sequences. So actually classifying activities according to similar to a sort of a repeat high intensity effort, I suppose. But we take every possible combination of either walk, jogging, striding or sprinting, and accelerating, decelerating, and also turns. So now we've got a sort of sequence of movements, and we can tell, okay, we can start to build up a sort of movement signature for this player, which is really cool, because now we're considering the sort of time element as well. And I suppose the last thing that we're missing from it is the performance. How does it affect performance? So what's the impact of these movement signatures, and considering performance as well? And I don't think it's in the too distant future, with collaborations also, with people such as Opta. Yeah, so in summary, I suppose we have these big picture questions, and I suppose the only way to answer them sometimes is with big data. Yeah, and I suppose that's what I'll be doing in the future, is actually looking at the why and the how the load is structured as well. So yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick. So we've got 10 minutes for some questions. Anyone got any questions on the floor? If not, I've got one to kick things off. Yeah, so I'll kick one off from for the guys. So in terms of the match demands, where can the coaches and can the coaches use this information to dictate what they do during the week? And we'll go for Nick. Got the mic, so yes, Nick.
What was that again?
So in terms of match demands, what can coaches use that for?
All right. Okay. Yeah. So it's an interesting question because going back to sort of what Dan was saying earlier about sort of are you running fit, are you contact fit? It's right. When do we actually implement that? Do we implement on our heaviest day? So do we say right? We've got a worst case running demand today. Do we try and hit that during training, or do we do some extra conditioning as well? And then do we have like a contact day as well? So we're now going into realms of sort of tactical periodization, which Jason will touch on later as well, I think as well.
I mean, it all depends on sort of using the GPS data in terms of having, right, if we understand the peak demand over a given duration, and then evaluating that in training in particular to say, obviously the main focus within the training week on field is during skills training. So are we exposing players during typical, where the focus is purely on technical, tactical aspects of the sport? Are we exposing them for that given duration consistently during technical, tactical training? Or do we actually try and create this hybrid model of, right, the focus or the content of the session is technical, tactical training, but there is an emphasis on exposing players to these peak demands. So then we're also tying in the aspects of, can they make a decision in the 9th minute of the peak demand and make the same decision or the right decision at 9 minutes that they would do in 1 minute, and getting that consistent exposure and evaluating. It might be, depending on how you prescribe your training, it might be that you do expose players to these demands, but evaluating that is a sort of an important process, I think, in terms of the coaching and prescription, and that's where the data can come in to provide an objective view of that.
Cool. Anything on the floor?
Thanks, guys. Kind of aimed a little bit at Sarah, I suppose, from your presentation. You were talking about exposing some of the players to greater demands in training to actually prep them for the higher levels. I suppose, could there be a risk of them being overexposed and taking them out of kind of like the sweet spot? And I suppose, how would you manage that?
Well, I think, so when you look at what the peak demands are, they're not actually, the average running speed, it's not actually that high. So I don't think there's a risk of overexposing them from a physical point of view. I think it's important that they get exposed to those running demands, like Dan said, during technical, tactical training. So they're being exposed to those intense periods while still playing rugby. And I think that would help prepare them, like, from a contextual point of view of less errors and stuff like that during match play.
Cool. Anything else? Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Give a round of applause to the guys.